When my wife and I first met, it felt like we were two halves of the same whole. She was confident, ambitious, and had a sharp mind honed by years in management. I admired her drive, her ability to command a room with just her presence. As for me, I was climbing my way up in coding, relying on raw talent rather than formal education. Our differences seemed complementary. At first she teased me about not having a degree, and I joked back about her corporate jargon. It was harmless fun, or so I thought. In the early days of our marriage, life was comfortable. We were equals in most ways, debt-free, earning similar salaries, sharing household expenses without friction. Date nights were frequent, laughter filled our home, and dreams of starting a family lingered in the air. But beneath the surface, there were cracks I chose to ignore. Small things that gnawed at me but which I dismissed as trivial, like how she'd often mock my work-from-home routine during dinner parties, calling me the suit-wearing recluse. Her friends would laugh along, and though her tone was playful, the words stung. One evening stands out vividly in my memory, a turning point I failed to recognize at the time. It was one of those gatherings where everyone brought their significant others, drinks flowed freely, and conversations buzzed around us. Someone asked what made our relationship unique. Without missing a beat, she smirked and said, "Well, he's reliable." If you find predictability exciting, the table erupted into laughter, but I felt the comment slice through me like a knife. My chest tightened, heat rising to my face. Was this who she really thought I was? A boring, predictable man and worthy of admiration. I told myself it was just a joke, an offhand remark meant to entertain. But deep down, doubt crept in. Why did she feel the need to belittle me in front of others? That night, lying awake beside her, I replayed the moment over and over again. Her casual dismissal of my efforts, her mocking tone, it all felt intentional now. Yet, I pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself that no marriage was perfect. These were minor hiccups, nothing more. But looking back, that night was a harbinger of what was to come. Beneath her polished exterior lay a growing dissatisfaction, one she masked with humor and subtle jabs. And I, blinded by love and denial, refused to see the truth staring me in the face. Little did I know, those seemingly innocent barbs were the first threads unraveling the fabric of our once happy union. When the pandemic hit, our lives shifted in ways I never anticipated. Like countless other couples, we transitioned to working from home, a change that initially seemed manageable but soon revealed cracks in our relationship. At first, it felt like a temporary inconvenience. We repurposed one of the spare bedrooms into her office while I continued using my existing setup. The house was quiet during the day, save for the occasional hum of keyboards clicking or phones buzzing. But beneath this calm exterior, subtle tensions began to surface. It started with small annoyances, things that might have been brushed off under normal circumstances but now loomed larger than life. She had a habit of playing music loudly when she knew I was on important video calls. It wasn't just background noise, it was disruptive enough to make me lose focus mid-sentence. When I asked her to turn it down, she'd roll her eyes and mutter something about how you're always so serious. Her tone carried an edge, as if my request was unreasonable. These moments left me feeling frustrated, yet I told myself they were trivial. After all, every couple has disagreements, right? But then came the more unsettling discoveries, the ones that gnawed at the back of my mind long after the arguments ended. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee from the kitchen, I overheard fragments of her conversation through her partially closed office door. Her voice was warm, almost flirtatious, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she often showed me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced inside. To my surprise, her laptop camera was off, a detail that shouldn't have mattered, except that it did. Over time, I noticed a pattern. She rarely turned on her camera during official company meetings, citing poor lighting or technical issues. Yet whenever she had private calls with her boss, the camera mysteriously came back on. At first, I tried to rationalize this behavior. Maybe she wanted to present herself professionally to her superior, or perhaps it was simply coincidence. But deep down, doubt crept in, whispering insidious thoughts I couldn't silence. Why would someone who claimed to hate being watched go out of their way to ensure visibility only with certain people? The inconsistency gnawed at me, planting seeds of suspicion that grew harder to ignore. The breaking point came one evening after a particularly grueling day. I had spent hours in back-to-back virtual meetings, trying to keep projects afloat amidst the chaos of remote work. Exhausted, I retreated to the living room, hoping for some peace. Instead, I found her sprawled on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a smirk plastered across her face. My presence didn't seem to faze her. When I asked what she was smiling about, she shrugged dismissively, saying, "Just work stuff." That phrase, so casual, so rehearsed, felt like a slap in the face. How many times had she used those words to deflect questions? And why did she suddenly seem so secretive? As days turned into weeks, these minor irritations compounded into something far more sinister. Our once shared routines crumbled under the weight of unspoken grievances. Date nights became non-existent, replaced by awkward silences and half-hearted attempts at conversation. Even cooking dinner together, a ritual we once cherished, felt mechanical, devoid of warmth. The woman I married, the confident and ambitious partner I admired, seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone distant and unfamiliar. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the world outside seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold inside my home. My wife handed me her old iPad with an offhand request, "Can you wipe this for me? I'm giving it to my niece." Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, and she left soon after, saying she had errands to run. I barely registered the exchange, nodding absent-mindedly over my coffee. It wasn't unusual. She often relied on me for tech-related tasks, but something about that day felt different. Maybe it was the way she avoided meeting my eyes or the haste with which she exited the house. Whatever it was, a faint unease settled in my chest. I set the iPad on my desk, planning to reset it later, but curiosity got the better of me. As I picked it up, I noticed it was still logged into her messaging app. Out of habit, I glanced at the screen and froze. The first message wasn't from me. It wasn't even from someone I recognized. But it didn't take long for reality to crash down like a tidal wave. There they were, messages, photos, videos, all exchanged between her and her boss. They weren't just explicit, they were damning. Each word, each image, felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. But the betrayal didn't stop there. Scrolling further, I stumbled upon something far more calculated, far more sinister than I could have imagined. In one conversation, she discussed plans not just for their affair, but for our divorce. She had consulted a lawyer weeks ago, detailing how she intended to leave me while ensuring she walked away with half of everything we owned. Half of everything. The woman who once promised to build a future with me was now meticulously plotting its destruction. And then came the message that shattered whatever remained of my composure. Addressing her boss, she wrote, "He won't do anything. He's too weak." Those 6 words hit me like a freight train, each syllable reverberating through my mind with deafening clarity. Too weak. Was that really how she saw me? After all these years, after everything we'd been through together, was I nothing more than a spineless fool in her eyes? The irony was suffocating. All those times I'd tried to bridge the growing chasm between us, the movie nights I suggested, the meals I cooked, the patience I showed when she pulled away, they meant nothing to her. To her, I was insignificant, powerless, and worthy of respect. The evidence mounted with every scroll. Conversations mocked my work-from-home routine, ridiculing the suits I wore to maintain professionalism during meetings. One particular line burned itself into my memory. "You're the only thing keeping me sane right now." The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. How dare she? How dare she sit across from me at dinner, smile at me in bed, and pretend everything was fine while secretly tearing apart the life we built together? By the time I reached the end of the messages, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the device. My vision blurred, tears threatening to spill over, but anger kept them at bay. Every ounce of love, trust, and admiration I'd ever felt for her had turned to ash. The woman I thought I knew, the confident, ambitious partner I admired, was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of remorse. I saved everything to a secure cloud drive before shutting the iPad and placing it back on my desk. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of her betrayal. My heart raced, my stomach churned, and my mind screamed for answers that would never come. What had I done to deserve this? Had I been blind to her unhappiness, or was this all part of some twisted game she played from the start? When she returned home later that evening, breezing through the door as though nothing was wrong, I couldn't even look at her. She tossed her keys onto the counter and greeted me with a cheerful, "Hey, how was your day?" Her voice sounded foreign and hollow, like the echo of someone I used to know. I mumbled something vague about work and retreated to my office, shutting the door behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I confront her, demand an explanation? But every imagined scenario ended the same way, with me choking on my own emotions, unable to articulate the storm raging inside me. Her lies weren't just casual deceptions. They were deliberate, methodical, and brazen. And now, armed with irrefutable proof, I realized the truth. Our marriage wasn't just broken, it was dead. What remained was deciding how to bury it. The private investigator's report arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it felt like the final piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. The evidence was overwhelming: photos of her entering his apartment building late at night, videos of them kissing in parking lots after work, time-stamped screenshots of their messages planning secret rendezvous. But what struck me hardest were the images from a luxury hotel downtown, where they had been meeting regularly for months. The photos showed them laughing, holding hands, even sharing intimate moments by the poolside bar. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated mockery of everything we had built together. Each photo burned into my mind like acid, etching itself into my memory with excruciating detail. There she was, the woman who once promised me forever, posing with another man as if I never existed. Her smile in those pictures wasn't forced or guilty. It was radiant, carefree, as though she reveled in her deceit. And him, he looked smug, confident, like he had won some kind of prize. Every image screamed arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty. They weren't just cheating, they were flaunting it, daring anyone to catch them. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the report, each new revelation hitting me like a punch to the gut. I called my lawyer immediately, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I'm ready," I said, cutting straight to the point. "Let's file for divorce." He paused on the other end of the line, perhaps sensing the storm brewing within me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked cautiously. "Once we start, there's no turning back." His words echoed in my ears, but they didn't give me pause. For weeks, I'd wrestled with doubt, guilt, and anger, but now clarity washed over me. This wasn't just about ending our marriage, it was about justice. That night, as I sat alone in my office, staring at the damning evidence spread across my desk, an idea began to take shape. If she thought she could have her cake and eat it too, then I would serve her exactly that, literally. The plan formed quickly, fueled by a mix of fury and dark humor. I reached out to a local bakery known for custom cakes and explained what I needed: the cake topped with an edible image of one of the incriminating photos. Not the most explicit one, of course. I wanted subtlety paired with impact. Above the image, bold decorative icing spelled out the words, "Here's your cake, eat it too." When I picked up the finished product, I couldn't help but laugh. It was absurd, petty, and undeniably cruel, but in that moment, it felt like poetic justice. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. I coordinated with the process server to deliver the cake along with the divorce papers directly to her office during lunchtime. She wouldn't see it coming, and that thought gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. The day finally came, our 5th wedding anniversary. As I waited anxiously for the update, my phone buzzed. The process server's voice crackled through the speaker, laced with barely contained amusement. "You won't believe the scene," he said. She was sitting with a group of coworkers when I walked in. Cake in hand, I set the box down on the table, opened it, and placed the papers next to it. Then I said, "You've been served." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. At first, she froze, just staring at the cake. One of her coworkers leaned over to look and gasped, "Oh my God." That's when she completely lost it. Screaming, swatting the cake off the table, but it landed face up on the carpet. Everyone saw it. A few people started laughing, others walked out. Her boss bolted out of the room without saying a word. I closed my eyes, picturing the chaos unfolding in her office. The humiliation, the shock, the sheer public spectacle of it all, it was cathartic. In that moment, I felt vindicated. The woman who had laughed in my face, who had dismissed me as weak and insignificant, was now exposed for everyone to see. Her lies, her arrogance, her belief that she could get away with anything, all of it came crashing down around her. It wasn't just satisfying, it was necessary, but as the initial rush of triumph faded, reality crept back in. My lawyer's warnings echoed in my mind: judges don't favor theatrics. Any act of pettiness could come back to haunt me in court. Had I gone too far? Would this stunt jeopardize my position in the divorce proceedings? I pushed the doubts aside, reminding myself why I did it. This wasn't about hurting her, it was about reclaiming my dignity. Still, the uncertainty lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. The aftermath of the cake incident was nothing short of a catastrophe. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire through her office, fueled by gossip and grainy videos captured on smartphones. My wife, once the confident, ambitious woman who commanded respect in meetings, was now reduced to a spectacle, the subject of whispered conversations and mocking glances. Coworkers who had once laughed at her jokes or sought her approval were now filming her every move, eager to capture her unraveling for their own entertainment. It happened during lunch hour, just as she returned from a tense meeting with HR. She must have known something was coming. The atmosphere in the office had shifted palpably over the past few days. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and even her closest allies, the ones she thought would stand by her, had begun distancing themselves. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. As she stepped into the break room, clutching a cup of coffee like it was a lifeline, one of her colleagues held up a phone, recording her reaction without hesitation. Her face turned pale when she realized what was happening. "Stop," she pleaded, her voice trembling, but no one listened. Instead, they closed in, their phones pointed at her like weapons, capturing her humiliation in excruciating detail. That evening, I received a text from a mutual friend with a link to a video that had already gone viral within the company. The clip showed her screaming, swatting away, hands holding cameras, tears streaming down her face. Someone had captioned it, "Guess karma really does exist." Comments flooded in beneath the post, some sympathetic, most cruel. One comment stood out: "This is what happens when you play with fire." Watching the footage, I felt a strange mix of emotions: of vindication, sadness, and an unsettling sense of finality. This wasn't the woman I married anymore. She was unrecognizable, a shadow of her former self, crumbling under the weight of her choices. But the real blow came 2 days later. An anonymous email landed in HR's inbox, containing everything: screenshots of her messages with her boss, photos of them together, timestamps proving their affair stretched back months. It was damning evidence, impossible to ignore. Within hours, HR called her into a meeting. From what I heard later, the conversation was brief but brutal. They informed her of the investigation and escorted her to her desk to collect her belongings. When she protested, insisting she hadn't done anything wrong, security was called. Two burly guards appeared, flanking her as they led her out of the building. The scene unfolded in slow motion, according to witnesses. Employees gathered around, some gasping, others smirking, as she walked past with her head bowed, clutching a cardboard box filled with her personal items. A few tried to say goodbye, but she ignored them, too humiliated to respond. At the elevator, one guard pressed the button while the other stood watch, ensuring she didn't linger. The doors slid shut, sealing her fate, and the crowd dispersed, buzzing with speculation about what would happen next. For weeks afterward, rumors swirled about why she'd been fired. Some claimed she'd seduced her boss to climb the corporate ladder. Others accused her of sabotaging relationships for fun. None of it mattered to her anymore. Without a job, her financial stability evaporated overnight. She sold her car to cover legal fees and moved in with her parents, who reluctantly took her in despite their growing resentment. Their patience wore thin as she borrowed money to survive, unable to find work in her field. Every interview ended the same way. Potential employers recognized her name, thanks to the scandal, and politely declined to proceed. Her reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was obliterated. Social media became a battleground, with strangers dissecting every aspect of her life. Old friends blocked her online, fearing guilt by association, while acquaintances shared screenshots of private messages she'd sent them, exposing more secrets. Even her family distanced themselves, tired of being dragged into her drama. Alone and defeated, she spiraled further into despair, haunted by the knowledge that she had brought this upon herself. The divorce proceedings were nothing short of a battleground, each side armed with their own arsenal of arguments and evidence. Her lawyer, a seasoned professional known for his ability to twist narratives, entered the fray with a desperate attempt to paint her as the victim. My client's actions, he began during one particularly heated session, were not born out of malice but rather desperation. She felt abandoned by her husband, emotionally neglected, and sought solace elsewhere. His words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, heavy and suffocating. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes shifting between him, my wife, and me. For a moment, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Abandoned, neglected. These claims were laughable given the mountain of evidence we had meticulously gathered over months. Every text message, every photo, every time-stamped screenshot told a story far removed from neglect. It was a tale of calculated deceit. My lawyer stood up calmly, his demeanor unshaken, and presented our case piece by piece. He highlighted how she had withdrawn emotionally long before any affair began, how her lies stretched back months, and how her behavior became increasingly erratic as she juggled two lives. But the most damning revelation came when he displayed a timeline on the courtroom projector, a visual representation of her betrayal. It started innocuously enough, vague texts exchanged late at night while I was asleep. Then came photos of them together, first casual then intimate, followed by videos that left no room for doubt. Each entry was marked with a date, showing how methodically she had planned and executed her deception. By the time the timeline reached its conclusion, even the judge seemed visibly unimpressed with her lawyer's narrative. Still, her attorney refused to back down. "Your Honor," he pleaded, "while my client may have made mistakes, they do not erase the fact that this marriage suffered due to mutual issues. To place all blame solely on her shoulders would be unjust." His voice carried a tone of desperation now, bordering on pleading. But the judge wasn't swayed. With a stern expression, she turned to us. "Mr. Name, does the defense wish to respond?" I glanced at my lawyer, who gave me a subtle nod. This was my chance to speak, though I knew better than to let emotions take control. Instead, I focused on the facts, recounting everything from the day I discovered her betrayal to the aftermath of her public humiliation. My voice remained steady, even as memories of those painful moments resurfaced. When I finished, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Even her lawyer seemed to deflate slightly, realizing his strategy was crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated, the emotional breakdown. As the judge prepared to adjourn for recess, my wife suddenly rose from her seat, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling, "don't do this. We can fix this. I love you, I've always loved you." Her words echoed through the courtroom, raw and desperate. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of pity. This was the woman I once vowed to spend my life with, reduced to begging in front of strangers. But then I remembered the laughter, the smugness, the arrogance, the way she dismissed me as weak and insignificant. "No," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "There's no going back after what you've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Her sobs filled the room, but no one moved to comfort her, not her lawyer, not even the bailiff. In that moment, she was utterly alone, the full weight of her choices crashing down around her. When the judge returned, her decision was swift and decisive. Based on the evidence presented, she declared, It is clear that the respondent has engaged in prolonged misconduct that irreparably damaged the foundation of this marriage. Temporary orders will remain in effect until the final ruling. As the gavel struck, sealing her verdict, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that justice was being served, but sorrow for the shattered remnants of what we once had. The fallout from the scandal rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water, leaving no one untouched. My ex-wife's boss, the man who had once strutted through the office with an air of untouchable authority, was the first to crumble under the weight of his actions. It started when his wife received an anonymous tip about his affair. Someone at his company, perhaps emboldened by the chaos that followed my public confrontation, decided it was time to spill the beans. His wife, furious and betrayed, launched her own investigation, scouring social media, emails, and any shred of evidence she could find. When she finally reached out to me, her tone was polite but laced with venom. "I need everything you have," she said bluntly. "He deserves every bit of what's coming to him." I hesitated for only a moment before forwarding her the damning files, the photos, the texts, the videos. She didn't waste any time. Within days, she filed for divorce, presenting the court with irrefutable proof of his infidelity. The judge sided entirely with her, stripping him of custody of their children, forcing him to sell their home to cover the settlement, and ordering him to pay substantial alimony. But the financial ruin was just the beginning. Word spread quickly among their social circle, fueled by his wife's refusal to stay silent. At dinner parties, school events, even grocery store runs, people whispered behind his back. He became a pariah, shunned by friends, colleagues, and acquaintances alike. Once a symbol of success, he was now a cautionary tale, a man who thought he could have it all and ended up losing everything. Meanwhile, my ex-wife's descent into despair accelerated as the walls closed in around her. After being fired from her job, she struggled to rebuild her life, only to find that the scandal had followed her wherever she went. Employers recognized her name, thanks to the viral videos and gossip circulating online. Interviews that began promisingly would end abruptly once they realized who she was. Her attempts to explain herself fell flat. No one wanted to hire someone tainted by such a public disgrace. Eventually, she resorted to working part-time at a local retail store, a far cry from her former corporate glory. But the betrayal that cut deepest came not from strangers or former colleagues, it came from the very people she had trusted most. The 3 coworkers who had once encouraged her affair, egging her on with whispers of how much better her life could be, turned on her without hesitation when HR launched their investigation. They threw her under the bus in exchange for leniency, painting her as the mastermind behind the entire mess. Their testimonies were brutal, detailing how she had confided in them about her plans to leave me, how she had mocked my predictability and dismissed our marriage as irrelevant. Each word felt like another nail in her coffin, sealing her fate within the company. By the time HR concluded their probe, her reputation was beyond repair. She was summoned to a final meeting, where she was handed a termination letter and escorted out of the building by security, her face flushed with shame as coworkers watched silently. Her family, already strained by the financial burden she imposed on them, began distancing themselves further. Her parents, who had reluctantly taken her in after she sold her car and depleted her savings, grew weary of her constant pleas for help. "We can't keep bailing you out," her mother reportedly told her during one heated argument. "You made your bed, now lie in it." Those words haunted her, echoing in her mind long after the fight ended. Alone in her cramped apartment, she spiraled deeper into isolation, unable to escape the consequences of her choices. Mutual friends described her as a shadow of her former self, gone, withdrawn, and visibly miserable. As for me, watching the wreckage unfold from afar brought a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also a lingering sadness for the lives that had been shattered. My ex-wife and her boss had both pursued selfish desires, believing they could manipulate circumstances to their advantage. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the ruins of their own making. The community that once celebrated their achievements now reviled them, and the families they had torn apart remained fractured beyond repair. In the end, Justice wasn't swift, it was slow, painful, and inevitable. Every decision they made, every lie they told, every betrayal they committed came back to haunt them. And while I couldn't undo the pain they caused me, seeing them confront the full weight of their actions offered a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Life, as it turned out, had a way of balancing the scales. In the aftermath of the divorce, as the dust began to settle and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, I found myself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The journey had been brutally emotionally exhausting, mentally taxing, and at times, almost unbearable. Yet, through it all, I couldn't deny the sense of vindication that came with knowing justice had been served. My actions, though extreme, were not without purpose. They were fueled by a desire for accountability, for truth, and ultimately, for closure. Looking back, I realized how blind trust can be both a strength and a vulnerability. In the early days of our marriage, I trusted her implicitly, believing that love and commitment would always guide us through challenges. But betrayal has a way of shattering even the strongest foundations. Her lies weren't just about infidelity, they were about dismantling the very essence of what we had built together. Every secret text, every whispered conversation with her boss, every dismissive comment about my predictability chipped away at the trust I once held sacred. And when that trust was gone, so too was any chance of reconciliation. The final counseling session, a formality more than anything else, was where I truly articulated the depth of my feelings. Sitting across from her over Zoom, I watched as she pleaded one last time for a second chance. Her voice trembled, her eyes filled with tears, but there was no sincerity left in her words. She still didn't understand the magnitude of what she had done. When the counselor suggested that relationships require mutual effort and compromise, I interrupted firmly. "This wasn't a mutual breakdown," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "She made a choice, a calculated, selfish choice, and that choice destroyed our marriage." As the session drew to a close, she asked if I'd consider another meeting, hoping against hope that something could be salvaged. But I knew better. There was no going back after everything that had happened. Logging off, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity wash over me. For months, I had questioned whether my methods, the cake stunt, the public exposure, were justified. Had I crossed a line? Was I being vindictive? But now, sitting alone in my office, I understood that sometimes justice requires boldness. It demands that we confront uncomfortable truths head-on, no matter how painful they may be. During that final moment of reflection, I remembered something she had said during our confrontation: "A woman can have her cake and eat it too." Those words, meant to mock me, became the cornerstone of my realization. In a strange twist of fate, her arrogance had led to her downfall. She thought she could manipulate circumstances, deceive everyone around her, and emerge unscathed, but reality proved otherwise. In trying to have it all, she lost everything: her dignity, her career, her family, and her freedom. When the counselor asked if I had any final thoughts, I paused, letting the weight of everything sink in. Then, I spoke softly but with conviction. "She thought she could eat the cake and still keep it," I said, "but in reality, she ended up with nothing. That's the thing about greed, it blinds you to the consequences of your actions until it's too late." The counselor nodded silently, perhaps sensing the depth of my pain and resolve. It was a lesson I would carry with me forever. Trust is fragile, and betrayal leaves scars that never fully heal. But more importantly, I learned that actions have consequences not just for others, but for ourselves. My ex-wife and her boss had pursued selfish desires, believing they could escape accountability. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the wreckage of their own making. Life, as it turned out, had a way of balancing the scales.